The bounce angle on your golf clubs, particularly on your short irons and your wedges, is an incredibly important part and often either misunderstood or just not spoken about part of your equipment decision-making process, and how it will definitely affect the way you play shots. So let's first understand what bounce is, and then we can talk about its role. So bounce is the fact that the leading edge of the golf club often sits above the trailing edge of the golf club. So if you take a club and you lay it flat on a tabletop, you'll see the leading edge is lifted up in the air, and that's lifted up by a number of degrees. And in your wedges, often that number of degrees will actually be written on. I've got two wedges here. I've got my sand wedge and I've got my lob wedge. The lob wedge is more lofted at 58 degrees, the sand wedge is at 54 degrees. So that's the degrees of loft that lots of people are familiar with. But also underneath the degrees of loft is another number stamped on the club head, and that's 0.4 and that's 12. So quite a big difference. 12 degrees to 4 degrees is a big difference. Now, the right way round for me to have that in my setup is my sand wedge has a lot more bounce, so the leading edge really sits up off the table edge, and the lob wedge has a lot less bounce on it. Now, the way we understand how the bounce works is as the club comes down towards the ground, the bounce will interact with the turf or even with the sand in a bunker to try and make sure the club doesn't dig in. Now, depending on the type of golfer you are, the type of swing mechanics you have, also the type of turf you play off, bounce either needs to be higher or lower. So you might have an understanding of what your bounce profile needs to be or should be, and then you can buy the appropriate wedges. If you're not sure what the bounce should be for yourself, I would suggest you go and see a dedicated custom fitter or PGA professional to encourage you to understand the right amount of bounce for your game, because there is very little point buying a load of wedges with the wrong bounce or mismatched bounces, or the bounces the wrong way around. My feeling in the game of golf is that I want lots and lots of bounce on my sand wedge, because bounce, when I'm playing a bunker shot, the sand wedge will come in, it will hit the sand, and I want the bounce to push the club back upwards again. So I have 12 degrees of bounce to my sand wedge, and that helps the club bounce up. What I wouldn't want to have is my lob wedge degrees of bounce, which is only 4 degrees. If I play that club in a bunker, I often feel like the club sort of stabs into the back of the ball and gets stuck. So if I was playing with my bouncy wedge here, the ball is sitting up nicely, I can actually use the club to sort of bounce off the turf, and I can get underneath the ball quite nicely and lift the ball up in the air. So even though I hit that ball a little bit behind, the club didn't dig in, it didn't stick, it didn't stab into the ground, and that was the bounce working for me. Bounce is almost like an insurance policy. It helps you when stuff goes wrong. If I play the same type of shot now but with my lob wedge, which has less bounce, only 4 degrees, I'm going to actually take the bounce off it by just putting my handle forwards, and then I'm going to hit behind the ball. And then when I do that, you can see the club just digs, because it sort of goes in almost knife-like. It just jabs into the back of the ball rather than bouncing up. Now, those two were quite extreme examples to kind of highlight what bounce will do, but you might feel that in your own game, that sometimes when you're playing with your lob wedge, the club just digs and sticks into the ground, particularly if you're playing that shot in a bunker. That could be due to the way you set up, the way you stand, but also the lack of bounce on your club. Try and investigate having a club that has more bounce to it. That way, when the club hits the ground, it will feel a lot more like it wants to brush the ground and take off. I often think like an aeroplane landing on the runway and taking off again. That's the bounce, just bouncing off the surface and taking off, rather than crashing the plane, which is sort of this one where we get too steep and just crash the plane. So consider how the bounce angle can affect the way you would play your wedges and your technique. Now, one other consideration is grinds. Now, this is getting really deep into the weeds of this topic, because we can have different grinds on wedges. So grinds will be where the lower spots or the flatter spots of the wedge are and where the bulbous parts are. Now, that could be due to your lie angle. Do you open the face a lot? Do you have your hands quite low? Do you have your hands quite high? Very difficult to understand that from an individual basis. Again, go and see a dedicated club fitter. They will talk to you about the loft of the wedge, the bounce of the wedge, and the grind of the wedge to make sure you get a perfectly suited wedge for your game.